Alright, in today's Whiteboard Wednesday, I'm going to cover some different training splits. So, not training for being able to do the splits, but how you arrange and split up the amount of work that you're doing throughout the week in your different workouts. And there are certain splits that I tend to favor because they apply to more people, but I tend to get pretty creative with splits, especially when working with more intermediate or advanced individuals. You can get a lot and often need to get a lot more creative with how you program their training. And so there are certain templates that I like to go to in terms of like a broad way to organize an individual's work throughout the day, and then within that general split, I will individualize the actual workouts. They're going to contain movements that are specific to the individual and what that individual needs to work on. Now, if we're talking about just beginners, people just starting off, typically you're looking at 2 or 3 days a week. It's typically something like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You want to try to space those days out as evenly as possible. So you might see full body Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Because again, beginners are going to need to work on a little bit of everything. And so it's going to be full body workouts each time. So something like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or a Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday, that sort of thing. If you're just doing 2 days in a row, or if you have, say, Monday, Wednesday, that's going to leave a lot of time where they're not really getting any sort of training, or at least not lifting. They may be getting some aerobic work in there. But you want to try to space it out a little bit more evenly to make those recovery periods between each workout a little more even. You can make the workouts a little bit more even, but that's not always going to work with everyone's schedule. And so for some people, they may only be able to train on the weekends, or people who have really crazy schedules, whether they're firefighters, doctors, some of those people who are shift workers. A lot of those individuals are going to have pretty crazy schedules. It may be 3 on, 1 off, something like that. So you have to make it work. So if an individual can only train on Saturday and Sunday, that's what you're going to have to do. Now, if you do that, are you going to be able to have them do 2 full body workouts? Probably not. Maybe, it depends on what they're going to be, but they're either going to have to be fairly moderate workouts, or one of them is going to be a little bit heavier or more intense, and then the second one's going to be a little bit lighter and more maybe skill and technique oriented, because you're not going to be able to do 2 really hard days in a row, and if you do, that's going to kind of set you back for the rest of the week. And if someone's already that busy, that's not really going to be the best option for them. So moving beyond beginners, when you start getting into intermediates, it's really going to depend on what their goals are, much more so than for the beginners. And it's going to depend on, are they competing in a particular sport? What is that sport? If it's running, they're going to have to do a fair amount of running throughout the week. And so they're not going to be able to do as much lifting. So they may be lifting twice a week. So again, Monday, Thursday sort of situation. Or, any other sort of spacing like that throughout the week. Now, if it's a sport like competitive CrossFit, that's going to be different because the sport is entirely based upon things that you do in the gym, primarily. Obviously, there are some outdoor components, swimming, running, biking as well. But they're going to have a lot of volume inside the gym. You're looking at typically a couple sessions a day. Training typically 5 days a week would be the norm for most competitive CrossFitters, lifting or some sort of metabolic conditioning workouts. 5 days a week, with 2 other days being reserved for lower intensity aerobic work. So that might be something let's see, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, with Wednesday and Sunday being days for low intensity MAP 10 aerobic work. And these days might contain different amounts of volume, and once you get into training for the competitive season, if you're going to regionals, for example, CrossFit regionals, you can just move this whole schedule over one so that you're training Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because that's going to represent the regionals weekend, those 3 days. And so you can use that for testing, essentially do mock competitions. Now, what those days are going to look like is going to vary significantly based on the individual. But going away from the topic of CrossFit and just going into more general templates, there are lots of different options. So we typically like to think in movement patterns. For bodybuilding, yes, you can definitely think in terms of body parts, and there are tons and tons of different bodybuilding splits out there that focus on certain body parts, back and bis, chest, tris, etc., etc. But if we're thinking about, especially about athletes competing in sports, field sports, running, CrossFit, etc., not physique-based sports, we think about movement patterns. So, for example, you have bending and pressing, so some sort of pushing, squatting, and pulling of some sort there on the Tuesday. Then again, we might see bending, pressing, squatting, pulling. This could be a mixture, or you might see something like squatting and then pulling on that separate day there, that 5th day. I don't know, that might be a little bit small and hard to see, but that's just an example. Depending on the time of the season and the sport, you might incorporate some single leg work in there as well. A very good split just in terms of strength building. You can use it for even bodybuilding type stuff as well. 4-day templates work very well. So it might be something as simple as upper body, and the next day doing lower body, then upper body, and lower body. So 4 days. And you could also potentially space those last 2 days out. So you could maybe get a little bit more intensity on each of those days. And so that works for a variety of programs. You see that with Texas Method, more advanced iterations of the Texas Method. You see that with a lot of different bodybuilding programs even as well. So that's another very good and viable option. Again, similar to the 5-day template that I showed earlier, you can have deadlift or some sort of bending there, pressing, squatting, pulling, bending, pressing, squatting, pulling. And of course, this is all going to be dependent upon the individual and what they need to work on. So for example, if we're putting bending first, bending movements, regardless of, if we're talking deadlift variations, for example, those, even if you're doing variations that force the individual to use lighter weights if they're lower intensity, that's still going to interfere with squatting more so than squatting is going to interfere with bending variations. So obviously someone like this, someone who would be using this template would have a weaker deadlift relative to their back squat, for example. If their squat is weaker relative to their deadlift, of course, not weaker than their deadlift. The deadlift should, for most people, be higher than the squat. But relative to the deadlift, if the squat is weak, then squatting is obviously going to need to be prioritized. And so you might see something like squatting, pressing, bending, pulling. And granted, some of the bending is going to cut it into a little bit the pulling on those days, but might not be a huge issue. So again, that would just be the same thing there. So again, prioritizing squatting. You can also go into some other templates, a good bodybuilding template, and it's also great for strength building as well, that I came up with, and at least as far as I know, I came up with it. It's a 5-day template, and you actually do all 5 days in a row, so it's great for someone who's a little bit more of an intermediate to advanced individual in terms of their training age, and say they only have weekdays to train. They're very busy on the weekends. They have a good chunk of time that they can devote to training on each of the weekdays. So the first day is posterior chain and biceps. And so this differs from the traditional sort of bodybuilding back and biceps in that it includes hamstrings as well. That's why I say posterior chain, not back and biceps. So it includes hamstring work as well. So again, we're looking at bending variations, things of that nature, hamstring work, as well as pulling variations, vertical pulling, horizontal pulling, and specific bicep work. The second day is chest, shoulders, and triceps. So again, pressing variations, horizontal, vertical, you can press at an angle, lots of options there, and then obviously specific isolation for shoulders and triceps. The third day is anterior chain, and then ab work can be done there as well, although it could potentially be done some of the other days too, depending on the individual and how much time they have and how much time they're spending on some of the other movements. But primarily anterior chain, and the abs would sort of be included in that as well. But again, so we're looking at squatting, back squats, front squats. You know, if we're looking at more of a bodybuilding focus, it could also be leg presses, hack squats, things like that. Single leg work is great. And then also looking at ab and hip flexor work as well. So different variations to work on core strength. And then we go back to chest, shoulders, triceps, and then posterior chain and biceps again. And so these can be varied a lot. Again, it all comes back to the individual and what's going to work best for them. I posted on Facebook once about variation, and as people kind of get into that intermediate stage in their training age, more variation is typically needed to get them to progress, especially for upper body movements. And typically, women respond better to variation than men, just as a general principle. But yes, and upper body typically responds better to variation than the lower body. So especially the upper body stuff here can be varied pretty significantly. Obviously, weaknesses, whether those are weaknesses in terms of strength or aesthetically, they're weaknesses. If a person wants to work on their physique, obviously you're going to target areas that are underdeveloped aesthetically. And so, yeah, you can change this and say the focus this day could be on horizontal pulling. The focus here might be on horizontal pushing. This might be vertical pushing, although both days might include some of both. Same sort of thing for the posterior chain and biceps. Those days, one of them might include vertical pulling, the other might include horizontal pulling, or again, might be a bit of both on both of those days with a focus more on one. And again, so we're looking at back development there, and bending movements as well as scapular work is great to throw in on those days. And so again, that allows you to cover a great deal of things, upper body and lower body. You can get a lot of volume with that particular template while still recovering very well. Sometimes you see, and this is becoming especially popular in powerlifting now, higher volume and higher frequency templates. And so you might see full body 4 days a week. And typically how that's broken up, one of the more effective ways to break that up, if you have, 4 full body days, you might see a lower body movement, an upper body movement, and then another lower body movement. On the second day, you might see an upper body movement, a lower body movement, and then another upper body movement. So you're getting an even, and the same thing here, because you're getting an even amount of total upper and lower sessions per week, but you put the lower sessions, the day with the 2 lower movements first, because that's going to be more taxing on the body. So this is essentially going to be a more heavy day, and this is going to be a little bit more moderate in terms of the overall loading and how much that's taxing your whole system. And so that's a great way to arrange that. And typically, squatting is going to be first, because again, squatting is going to interfere less with deadlifting than deadlifting will with squatting. Although deadlifting and front squatting, you can sometimes deadlift prior to front squatting and it's not going to interfere with it that much. It just depends. But typically squatting, and then if we're talking about powerlifting, that's going to be some sort of bench variation, and then we're looking at a deadlift variation there. Here, it's probably going to be some sort of bench variation. And then the lower body movement there is going to depend on what that person needs to work on. So it might be some sort of deadlift assistance, or it might be squat assistance, depending on what that person needs to work on. And the second upper movement might be some sort of overhead press, maybe an incline bench, something that's a little different from traditional benching, which they're already going to be doing a lot of. And so essentially it would be the same thing for those other 2 days too. And that's a template that you sometimes see with reactive training systems, some of those athletes, and some of the things that Mike Tuchscherer and those guys recommend in terms of a general template. But in terms of what those actual movements are, that's going to be very individual. Someone might need, for example, a stiff leg deadlift. And someone else might need a rack pull as deadlift assistants. Someone else might need pause deadlifts. Someone might do pause squats or tempo squats, front squats, safety bar squats. Bench press, same sort of thing. Depending on where they're weak, it might be a wider grip bench, might be incline bench, might be overhead press, might be push press. And another thing that you can do is also alternate some of those movements each week instead of varying it every single week. Oftentimes that can work very well in terms of hypertrophy and things of that nature, but for building strength, a lot of times you need a little bit more repetition of different movements. And so what you'll see is, say a person does, and just picking out this specific movement on the specific day, so the lower movement here on the second day, say it is a stiff leg deadlift. The next week, maybe it's a rack pull. And then the third week, it's back to a stiff leg deadlift again, and it's over and over again, because you're not just driving yourself into the ground each week doing the same excuse me doing the exact same movement every week. I swear I'm all right. You're not driving yourself into the ground doing the same movement every week, and that way you're able to work on some more weaknesses that you may have, but you're getting it often enough to still actually drive progress. And so that's very important if we're talking about specifically about strength building. And so those are just a few examples of some different splits that I have used for myself or for others. And obviously there's an endless amount of splits, and they're not all confined to 7 days even. You can have 8-day splits, 9-day splits. So it's something that you can get very creative with, but there are certain splits, certain templates that have worked well for a lot of people for a very long time. And what's really needed is a level of individualization beneath that template. So you can use one template for a lot of people, but it's only going to be effective if the individual movements within those workouts are specifically designed for the individual performing them. And of course, the only way to determine that is through a proper and very thorough assessment, physical assessment. And of course, it's going to be based upon the person's goals, their schedule, their diet, sleep, everything else. And again, I can't get into that enough or stress that point enough, how important it is to have that individualization regardless of what training split you're using. And if you're designing your own training, that's fine, but it's not going to be as effective as having someone who can look objectively at your strengths, at your weaknesses, and test and figure out exactly what you need to do to achieve your goals. And so that's what Comprehensive Strength is here for. So as always, feel free to shoot me an email at jonathan@comprehensivestrength.com. Shoot us a Facebook message, leave comments on the Facebook post, on the video on YouTube. We'd love to get feedback from people and hear about what people want to, what I should talk about in these Whiteboard Wednesdays. We always appreciate feedback and getting ideas from people. And you can also give us a call. Our number is on the website, on the contact page, and also on our Facebook page. So give us a call, shoot us a message anytime you want, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And then we'll see you next week.